Hello, everybody.
Whoa.
My name is Arthur Blodgett, and I am your host, and I'm stoked to be here. And I'm joined as always by my handsome and charismatic co-host, Mr. Phillip Lietz, whose video unfortunately is not working at the moment. So you'll just have to imagine the most handsome man you've ever seen, and
Oh
that
my
is
God,
exactly
dude.
what Phil looks like. And we're excited to talk today about gut loading and have just kind of a good conversation about it. This is a topic that has been covered in depth by many reptile related content creators. And so we're not going to be super granular stuff about the how to of it, but more a little bit about the general theory around it and some general application, as well as some kind of discussion banter between Phil and myself about the subject. But before we dive into all that, I just want to talk to you a little bit about Happy Dragons, and they're the ones who make this possible for us. So, Happy Dragons is an awesome service called Happy Dragons Plus, which you can see here. And Happy Dragons Plus is a community hub that also allows certain perks for paid subscribers, like discounts with Happy Dragons supply partners like Josh's Frogs and Ovipost and others. It also has some perks like expert Q&A and consulting options with folks like Mariah Healy from Reptiles. But more than all of that, it's really just aiming to become kind of a community hub for people who are, interested in progressing their reptile keeping and care and who want to talk about that with other like-minded individuals. So check it out, Happy Dragons Plus, and you can get a free trial subscription. There will be some links in the chat. There's also a link posted in the video description, so check it out there. But anyway, with all that said, let's dive into some conversation around gut loading. And first, I kind of want to hear a little bit from Phil about gut loading.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, what do you have to say?
Yeah. So gut loading, I mean, I'm actually pretty excited to talk about this in general because it's something that, I remember kind of taking for granted. And I remember being, I don't know, maybe like 11, 12 in that age range and reading the old book, the Bearded Dragon Manual by Philippe Lietz, Bob Mayu, Alan Rapace, like that, sort of classic old book because that was what I was into at the time. And I remember that kind of being like the first time I ever really heard the term gut loading and had it spelled out for me, right? Someone put it in there and said, "Hey, you know, you want to gut load your feeder insects." Known it, it kind of outlined the term. And I remember at the time feeling like it was like a light bulb moment for me. It was like, "Oh, duh, that's incredible." Like it was this weird like a kind of a weird like a conceptual light bulb moment in which I realized like, oh, there's so much more to think about with regard to our captive herps. And I took it for granted in the sense that I just took it immediately as a given, like this is only a good thing. The giving our animals just like the utmost nutrient dense, constantly available foods, like is the move, like this is the whole thing. And I kind of operated with that mindset for a long time about gut loading in particular. And it's only within the last like 4 or 5 years or so that I've kind of changed how I conceive of gut loading. Um, and so, I think this is probably an area where the discussion would take place. But the when I think of the term gut loading, I think of uh, specifically with regard to feeder animals, anything you're going to feed to your reptile, I think of gut loading as a way of in delivering nutrients to your captive animal by way of a prey item, right? So that's kind of like the way I would define gut loading. And I think that oftentimes gut loading gets conflated with like, let me get an intravenous IV into my reptile and give it nutrients directly right now because more is better always. So I think what the thing to do here would be I just kind of gave my definition of gut loading. Roy, why don't you do the same? Savannah, I'd like to hear from you too if you're interested. And um, and then we can maybe discuss it thereafter and talk a little bit more about kind of good and bad and all that stuff.
Yeah. So, yeah, I made a basic little like companion PDF just for folks to have a look at. It's very basic, like I said, and it's got some links to some resources that I would recommend checking out that cover this subject in a lot more depth and granularity. So that's in the video description if anyone wants to pull that up. But basically, the definition that I kind of wrote up for it is gut loading is the process of altering a feeder's nutritional content by feeding it highly nutritious and or calcium-rich food shortly before offering it to your pet herp. And the why for that is that most reptile feeder insects that we have commercially available are not sufficiently nutritious just in an empty stomach state, so to speak, for the animal to sustain itself in perpetuity. And so you can gut load those feeders to balance the feeder's calcium to phosphorus ratio and also, boost its gut content to have other nutrients in there as well. And that offers a lot more value to your pet reptile. So that's how I think of it. And I think that this is one of those subjects that you can go in incredible depth with it. And I think that sometimes folks can overthink it to some degree. But I think that it is also important and something that should be explored more. I know that some folks are doing some really interesting things with like figuring out like how gut loads are related to carotenoids and color in their reptiles. We spoke a little bit about that with Savannah, who's our producer for today's show, in our last live on Abronia. So I recommend folks check that out there. But anyway, it's something that I think does have value and utility. And yeah, so that's kind of where I stand with it.
I love that. That's like a much more, there were aspects of what you said there that were way more concise than my particular definition. Obviously there's probably like a dictionary definition, right? But yeah, I'm really, I love this topic because it kind of, I feel like people are really good at conceiving of how valuable something like gut loading can be. And it seems like an easy win. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It's like sometimes the things we're trying to do for our animals can almost be like a pretty heavy lift, depending on the size of enclosure we're dealing with, how complicated our lighting can get. Like, how do you regulate humidity? And, how do we, what methods we have to do with that? And what about seasonal planning? And what about, all this stuff? So it can be kind of sometimes it can be a lot. It can be a big task. But something about gut loading seems kind of straightforward. It's like, oh, I just like feed good food to the stuff I'm going to feed to my animals, and I'm doing a good thing for it. So I really like it. I think it's kind of a cool, again, easy win, right? When you
Totally.
having that bar for success always feel like it's in reach, because it really is most of the time. And it's certainly, I when I kind of gave my little intro spiel, I kind of talked about it in a way where it almost seemed like I might be kind of against gut loading, just sort of by my verbiage. But I just want to be clear, that's not at all what I'm talking about here. Like I'm talking about some of my conceptions around gut loading and the stuff I'll talk about later on, or as we get into this discussion rather, is not in any way meant to be like negative. It's just, I'm always trying to find like a better way to do what I'm already doing. So hopefully that gives a little bit of preamble for like sort of how the discussion is going to unfold. So can I ask Savannah if she has anything to say about this, or is that like, or does she not want to? Like, that's totally cool either way. I just figured I'd be curious. Oh, well, we can hear you. No, it's okay. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay. Sorry about that. Well, okay. So, Roy, what else is on that? Is that companion PDF something you wanted to go over, or are we just going to kind of get into the content?
Not too much. I mean, like I said, it's just like a super basic one, but I mean, with covering like kind of the what, why, how, and then it has some suggested reading resources for the how. part of it, I just said, simply feed your feeders before offering them to your reptile. So instead of like,
Right.
if you're going to Petco and you're buying a bunch of crickets, or if you're ordering your crickets online, typically the state that they're in when they arrive to you is not going to be their most nutrient dense state. Often they have an empty stomach at that point. And so, I just, keep them alive for weeks at a time. And I just make sure to feed them throughout that time with, delicious, good fruits and vegetables. Some of it's stuff that we're growing here in our garden, and some of the stuff I'm getting from the grocery store. But some of the things I use kind of regularly would include, squash, pumpkin, yams, sweet potatoes, carrots, leafy greens like kale, chard, dandelion, arugula. And also I'll sometimes do fruits, but typically less often. But among the fruits, I've done banana, apple, orange, strawberries. Um, Pretty much honestly any kind of like kitchen scraps. Sometimes when I'm like making a salad in the kitchen, I'll like pull some stuff aside for the bugs. And my
I do that
partner will kind
same
of tease
thing.
me about it. And I'll be like, all right, this portion is going to the bugs. And yeah, and that way also I like that because I think that when I'm kind of looking at it almost as like a byproduct of my own diet, there's
Yeah.
likely to be some kind of inherent seasonality in that. It's like, typically the fruits and vegetables that I'm consuming regularly are what's in season, and so I think that there's actually some benefit to like seasonality in the kind of nutrients and foods that the insects are receiving, and then our reptiles, or our herptiles, I should say, are receiving in turn.
I
Um,
love that, man. Can I add a little bit
yeah,
to that too?
yeah, please.
Yeah, so the seasonality thing I think is pretty important, right? Because again, the thing that I like about the concept of gut loading is that it can create like a really low barrier for entry for people to start learning about ways of bettering the life of their captive animal, right? So it's a win. Um, but it also kind of acts as like a bit of an entry point and kind of opens doors for thinking about other aspects of our care in which we could make small but meaningful changes. And so when I think about seasonality, the thing that jumped to my mind immediately now is the fact that it's free food season here in Colorado. So like I am going around picking dandelions and all kinds of other fancy foods for all of my herbivores, and it's only stuff that they're going to get in the warmer months, spring and summer. And what's cool is you can kind of couple it with bringing a butterfly net and grabbing a bunch of wild bugs, who don't need any gut loading because they're as perfect as they can be because they're purely wild. uh, and it can just act as a way of like, adding in, if you're already thinking about seasonality, like what else can I do on top of like feeding my animal more nutritious foods? How do I diversify and vary that diet as much as I possibly can, right? Because even with gut loading, I feel like variety is the key. You just mentioned all these different fruits and vegetables that you're offering to your feeder bugs and feeder animals, and I'm doing the same thing over here all the time. I'm looking for,
Mhm.
and I'll just like randomly go and find something and say, hey, I wonder if the crickets will eat this, or I wonder if the roaches will eat this. You know what I'm saying? And just throwing it in, seeing if they enjoy it, and then seeing if there's any change or anything weird noticeable in the reptiles. You know, it's kind of a fun way of going about it. I like it anyway.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There's also, I just want to cover something really quickly here that of like something that came up in the chat of just like, gut loading not being a substitute for proper supplementation, which is not something we're going to talk about in depth on this webinar, but definitely something that's going to be covered in the future. Because supplementation, with calcium and various vitamins is really important in addition to, providing a good diversity of feeders and good diet for the feeders. So,
Yeah, and
um,
it's worth noting too. Not to interrupt you, Roy. I hope I didn't
yeah,
cut you
no,
off.
go ahead.
But, it's worth noting on that topic in general. Uh, supplementation and nutrition as a baseline foundation of a topic is going to be so wildly variable when it comes to herpetoculture
Hmm.
that it's almost unbelievable, right? Because we're dealing with, like, herpetoculture encompasses everything from dart frogs to crocodiles. So when we're thinking about things like what does a supplement mean in the context of, you know, a dart frog and a crocodile, we're talking about two very, very different things, right? And in gut
Hmm.
loading,
Hmm.
but in gut loading, we're talking about essentially the same thing, giving a better feeder that you're going to feed, right? So nutrition is a highly nuanced and, you know, not, I don't want to say speculative, but it's like there's limited information on the diversities of reptile and amphibian nutrition. So be very careful about taking anything as gospel, because it's so diverse.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and there's also a number of other ways that people pursue gut loading, like various commercial diets. There's Missouri, I think, has an insect gut load diet. I know that Rapashi makes an insect gut load diet. I know a lot of folks that also will, and I've done this actually in the past, will use products like Pangea or Black Panther Zoological, like gecko diets, to feed their insects before offering them to their reptiles. And that is also totally valid, and I think is can be really useful, especially for animals that are like, I think, like severely malnourished.
Oh
I have
yeah.
done that with extra success, to kind of, or like just to give them a bit of a boost, I should say. And I think that that's a great way to do it. But I think that as far as that, like, and there are people that would probably just prioritize that as their primary gut load all of the time. And I think that it's likely an expensive way to do it, but I don't necessarily think it's the wrong way.
Yeah.
um, I think that it's kind of something that I do more supplementally. So like if I'm feeding, insects, every day, maybe 1 or 2 days out of the week, I might do something like that rather than every single day.
Right.
Unless, again, like I said, it's like for lizards, like for example, the Polychrus I've talked about at length in the past. When I'm working with like fresh imports of them, they come in, they're often pretty malnourished, they're
Mhm.
dehydrated, and so I do utilize those diets. I'll kind of gut load my feeder insects on Rapashi, Pangea, those kinds of things before offering them, just to try and kind of
Cool.
pass along some of that extra nutrition to those animals. Have you ever
Yeah.
experimented with that, Phil, with your stuff?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've also, I mean, it's actually also a great way to see what kind of things aren't good for your for your feeders, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm sure you've had this same experience where you're like, okay, let's see what happens when I feed this to my feeder insects, and then you give it to them, and the next day you come in and half of them are all dead. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there was anything wrong with the food. It's just that it like was not really what the so let's say for example the crickets needed in that given moment. I feel like it's also really similar, like conceptually, to feeding your feeder insects a commercial mammalian diet, right? So whether that's giving them dog or cat food, which is actually something that some people will do, and just feed it directly to their reptiles, which is even more interesting. But uh you know I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, just it's a similar topic, and I think it's one of those things that also raises a little bit of the topic of being like a little bit cognizant and a little cautious sometimes with what you're going to use as a gut load, because remembering that if we're treating the feeder insect as a delivery method to get nutrients
Hmm.
to our captive pets, that can mean it can also be a delivery method for something bad, right? So making sure that we're not feeding those insects something that could be harmful to the animals, which speaking of commercial diets, I've heard, I haven't had this happen myself, but I've heard of contaminants getting into commercial dog and cat foods, which had then been
Hmm.
fed to, I think, to some skinks or something, and it subsequently killed the skinks,
Oh
right?
man.
And so, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't. Again, I'm sure that happens in all different contexts, but it's at least worth bringing it up as a reminder that caution is useful here too.
Yeah, totally. Another thing I want to cover about this too is just like that one of the definitions of gut loading too, and kind of one of the functions of gut loading is actually related to the feeder insect's calcium to phosphorus ratio. And a lot of actual commercial gut loads um, seek to basically boost the calcium to phosphorus ratio in the feeder insect to get it to closer to an even ratio, um, which is optimal for feeding your animals. And so that is actually toxic for the feeder insect. So it's essentially going to die in a short period of time from that boost of calcium. And so, especially if you're offering feeder, if you're doing like the supplementation method, where you're using commercial gut load products, that's something to keep in mind is that your feeder insects are likely not going to serve. They can't like that's not a maintenance diet for your feeder insects, and so they're gonna die within 48 hours of that. And you'll often see this number quoted within herpetoculture circles that like you want to feed off your feeders within 48 hours of being gut loaded, and that's specifically talking about gut loads that are seeking to alter that calcium to phosphorus ratio to get it to a 1-to-1 ratio, because otherwise they're gonna die before they actually can be effectively fed to your reptile.
I didn't know I didn't know that's what was doing it. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I feel like it's something that I had to learn the hard way when I was like a teenager feeding stuff, noticing
Yeah.
that like using commercial diet stuff I didn't realize it was like going to kill my feeders, but it was totally coming from like a misunderstanding that I had early on about like what those gut load diets were actually for.
Right.
Um, and but again, I think that like this is one of those differences that I'm talking about again, where it's like, are you intensively gut loading for the function of that a boost of calcium to phosphorus ratio, or is it like, you're trying to feed your feeders a nutritious diet to keep them alive and hoping that some of that benefit will pass on to your animals? And I think that the optimal way to go with this is to do a bit of both.
Mm. So, so you mean by both, you mean like making sure that you're maybe taking advantage of the feeder animal as a delivery method and also optimizing for the best like sort of best nutrition for your said feeder animal. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I guess what I mean is to do both methods, I guess. Like
Ah, yeah.
like I think it's good to your feeders on like a diet of good fresh produce.
Right.
And like again, the benefit that that's going to pass on to your reptiles is going to be
Yeah.
small, but I think meaningful in aggregate. And in
Yeah.
addition to that, I think it's good to sometimes just like in a more supplemental, I would say supplemental in the sense of like less frequent, less not as a staple necessarily, be using these commercial gut load products as well. And trying that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so
Does that make
funny.
sense, Phil?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
No, for sure. That's very clarifying. I mean, it's so funny. Like my gut loading, gut. My gut reaction when when I hear that like balancing the calcium phosphorus ratio for your feeders causes them to die is like that's the exact opposite of what I want to do. Like you know what I'm saying? Like my gut reaction is that like the best thing I can feed my reptile is a healthy, thriving feeder. And of course,
Mhm.
I also think it's true that we also sometimes want to give our animal like a skeleton, basically. You know what I mean? Like, so, like because
Mhm.
of course, animals that are predators will, when they can, they'll probably pick off something that's a little jacked up, right? Whether
Mhm.
that's a grasshopper with a missing leg, or maybe it's like starting to slow down because it's old, or maybe it's sick, whatever. They'll just rip it up, eat it up. It'll get consumed. And so I kind of think about that as like a akin to gut loading in a way. You know what I'm saying? It's like
Mhm.
it's the same thing in my eyes. And it really goes against what my it's such a strange feeling of resistance wanting to say like, oh, I don't want to do that at all, when I know it's also a good thing,
Mhm.
to gut load them in that way. So weird, right?
It is. It also makes me think about, again, just like the kind of seasonality aspect of what approach. I think about this a lot when it relates to feeders.
Mm.
Um, Encourage breeding and stuff in my animals, but which I typically like the main variable that I'm manipulating when I'm food cycling my animals to encourage breeding and all of that is quantity of feeders and frequency that I'm feeding them. That's the
Yeah.
primary variable. But another variable that I've been considering in all of this is how how those feeders are actually gut loaded, and also what kind of feeders I'm offering. So for
Yeah.
example, I found like particularly with my polychris that you know, I really like to give them a lot of caterpillars, like silkworms, hornworms, waxworms, moisture rich, nutrient dense feeders
Yeah.
in just a
Yeah.
certain part of the year when I'm again trying to encourage that that cycling essentially for reproduction. It's not to say that
Mm.
I don't give them those feeders at other times in the year. I do, but I just do so a lot more sparingly. And I think that is one of the signals to them that says, okay, now is the time to go.
Right.
Because this is something also that like I've spoken to in the past, if you're witnessing, like where I live in, Northern California. And one thing that I'm always just amazed by and kind of enjoying the beauty of is this perfect kind of cycle of how the songbirds nest and how they're essentially their peak nesting season is the peak of caterpillar season, which is the peak of brand
Yeah.
new oak leaves season, and so all of these things are following cues, right? Like the insects are laying their eggs in time for their caterpillars to emerge right when they're really nice, fresh, new growth on the oak leaves
Right.
that's easily consumed by them. And in turn, the songbirds are timing their nesting for when those caterpillars are going to be available to then feed their young, because they're feeding tens of thousands of caterpillars, to their young sometimes for,
Mhm.
before they fledge, which is just incredible to think of. But I think about, again, translating that all back to our reptile keeping. I think that there is some benefit, in seasonality with all of these things and offering a diversity of things. I'm not ever saying that, we should strive to like give our reptiles empty feeders at any point in the year, so to speak. But I think that it's very likely that depending on where your reptile is from and how things go, there are times of the year where the feeders that they're going to be consuming are much more nutrient dense than other times.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I feel like this kind of generally goes back to a topic that comes up for us all the time, which is, like randomness or variability, just like letting things be uncontrolled, not always trying to optimize and deliver the most intense, amazing thing you can possibly deliver. Also being um I don't know, just like having in a little measured and diagnosed or prescribed variety, right? In a way that almost takes it out of your hands, right? Just going with what's easiest because that's what's available is actually a
Mm-hmm.
great way to stay in tune with seasonality, like you were talking about, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be a lot harder to procure dandelions in December in Colorado. Like it's going to
Yeah.
be a lot harder, right? And even though my animals aren't native to Colorado, it's not about them being native here and responding exactly and directly to the things available to them here. It's about
Mm-hmm.
uh, having some level of distinction at every level of seasonality, from lighting
Right.
to humidity to nutrients and availability of food sources, as you said, amount and frequency. On top of that, seasonal availability of water, seasonal availability of other animals in the vicinity, right? Being willing to change all this stuff up. And this happens at a micro level if you're going to gut load, right? So if you're going to, if you've just gotten a batch of 1,000 crickets and you're trying to prep or whatever they are, like any bug, insert any insect or rat or rabbit or whatever here, you're going to, it's going to be beneficial to your animals to feed those things in accordance with what is like what's right immediately around you, what's available, or just change it up. Do a beet one day, a watermelon the next day, a squash the next day, and a damn potato the next day, right? Like it just don't get stuck giving the same things over and over again. Obviously, you will do that from time to time too. It's like you can kind of even invert that on its head. Like, again, as I was mentioning earlier, it's dandelion season here. So literally everything is getting dandelions as long as they're available outside. And it's been almost a week and a half, 2 weeks or so, and I haven't given them anything else. Everything has eaten just dandelions for like 2 weeks, and it's going to be that way until the dandelions are gone. Why? Because the season changed a little bit and the dandelions aren't as prevalent and available. Well, then it's going to become wild alfalfa, right? So, learning how to gut load your feeder insects is also just okay. Now I'm just rambling on a little bit. Let me stop there for now.
No, that's good. We actually had an interesting question in the chat, which is was asking about how to get water into the feeders as well. And this isn't something that I guess I haven't thought too much about, honestly, apart from just making sure that there is a water source available for the feeders that I'm offering. I'm not offering dehydrated feeders. And of course, it has to be a water source that is something that is accessible to the feeders. One way that I approach that too is also just, and I don't tend to give like a lot of dry food to my feeders. I try to give them stuff that is still living, like living vegetation, living greens, that kind of thing. And in addition to that, give them access to water with a shallow dish with like a sponge, or water crystals is another thing people will use to make sure their feeders are hydrated. But again, it really depends on the type of feeder that you're doing this with. And I'm curious, Phil, if you have any thoughts about that, about like making sure that feeders are hydrated.
Yeah, I actually think identically to the way you do on that. Like I've never really put a whole lot of thought into considering how to deliver water through the feeder into something, and some of that I think is just related to, they seem pretty damn hydrated. Like when I leave like a piece of a grapefruit and some dandelion greens in with the crickets, they tend to look pretty fat and orange and green on the inside, And so when the animals go and bite into them, you can see all the food that they've been eating over the last day or two just squirt out of them. It's hilarious. Well, it's kind of gross too. Yeah, it's a little bit of a rough end for those feeders. You know what I'm saying? But like, they seem pretty damn hydrated. I feel like it would be difficult to try to. And I actually won't touch those water crystals, not for a second. It just spooks me, man.
Personally, I don't either. I feel like I get weirded out by them as well.
And
another thing that Savannah just offered too was just like when you're offering your produce to have it freshly washed, which is also something actually I wanted to mention earlier too, that it's a good idea to do that anyway, because sometimes produce can have residual pesticide and stuff like that on it. So you really want your produce to be thoroughly washed before you offer it to your feeders anyway, but it's another good way of giving it a little bit more water in there.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Excuse me. Jesus Christ.
This is also kind of something I wanted to bring up as well, which is, this we've been talking specifically about insects this whole time, and gut loading insects to feed to our reptiles, which is, the primary way that that's considered and thought about in herpetoculture. But I also think about this with other feeders, like If you're feeding snakes, and you're offering them quail and chicks and mice, rats, that kind of thing. What is the quality of the food that those animals are receiving as well? And this is another thing that I do occasionally, which some people might be weirded out or grossed out by, but I think is potentially a benefit to my animals. And again, I tend to do this seasonally. Is I'll actually use like a large gauge syringe to inject a bit of like Pangea or Repashy into a mouse or a chick, a frozen thawed, I should say, specify, not a live one, a frozen thawed mouse or chick
Very
before offering it
important
to the
distinction.
snake.
Thank you.
Yeah, very important distinction. And
just,
or I
just
mean, I suppose you could, if you're offering live, feed, your mouse that kind of thing as well.
yes.
But I'll do that occasionally because I think that that's another thing that is potentially overlooked with our snakes in particular. And there's actually something I think that maybe Ron St. Pierre was talking about recently. He has a theory about this with emerald tree boas and potentially why they're so prone to regurgitation, particularly among wild caught animals. It might have to do with the actual diet that's fed to commercial rodents and stuff like that.
Oh yeah,
And
sure.
the gut content in those rodents actually agitating the digestive system of some of these snakes, which are, a lot of the things that like an Amazon tree boa or an emerald tree boa down in the Amazon that takes down an arboreal likely rodent or a possum down there, whatever that animal has been eating, that opossum or rodent has been eating is going to be very different than a commercial rodent diet. So I think that there might be something to that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, I think that's absolutely brilliant and an important, yeah, very important little extra bit. I have not ever done anything like that, and now I'm definitely going to try. That's really cool. I've never done anything like that. But
Yeah,
because
it's
I've always
something I've
been,
thought about just again with like the seasonality thing is what made me think of it again, because like
sure.
I'm sure that like that again, that's the main reason or the main way that I cycle all of my tropical herbs here is through food cycling. I mean, I also manipulate precipitation variables and misting variables and all that stuff. But food cycling is a big part of it. And it's one of the things that I think has led to some success breeding the sulfureus here and all of that. Is just that I feed them sparingly during one part of the year, and then in the spring, I boost the precipitation. I feed them a lot more frequently, and I'll feed them stuff again with Pangea sometimes in its belly, because I'm imagining like, if you're getting heavier seasonal precipitation in the tropics, everything's going to respond to that. Everything will become more abundant when that water is more abundant. The fruit that's going to follow from the plants responding to that is going to be something that ultimately the snakes will benefit from as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that like, I mean, I think that's kind of true both maybe just on a different kind of scale of like the deserts, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
in great times, everything's going to get more jacked and more abundant and, a little more full, and they're going to breed more and they're going to be out more and they're going to be taking advantage of all that resource and opportunity. It's just probably going to happen in more predictable and shorter time frames than in the tropics, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
Something like this. And so actually this kind of brings up a fun question that I think is kind of weird. Do you think you can gut load for an herbivore
Yeah, that's a really great question.
without a bug though?
I Yeah, without a bug. I mean, I feel like you could using the commercial gut load, like the supplements by like, off like powdering it, on their food,
Yeah.
like as a supplemental powder on top of their salad, or for those that accept the kind of gel premixes,
Yeah.
maybe offering it in that method. But that is like something I'd love to hear more about from you, Phil, because
Sure.
like obviously the herbivorous reptiles things is kind of outside of my wheelhouse. I don't keep anything herbivorous at the moment. I mean, the
Yeah.
polychris omnivorous, but still
semi-omnivores.
highly,
Yeah.
yeah, highly insectivorous. So what do you think
Right.
about that?
Yeah. So that I honestly is kind of a leading question, obviously.
Yeah.
Because it's like I I think this is a great way of kind of discussing how, like, what's really the difference between gut loading and supplementation at the end of the day. Like, do you think would
Mhm.
you I guess this is kind of a question for you to help. It's like a question to answer the question. Would you think of gut loading as a form of supplementation, or indistinct from supplementation, perhaps? Is that something that you would
That's a
what
great
do you think
question.
about that statement?
I mean, yeah, I think that this is like, I think that for the purposes of like this kind of conversation, it's helpful to create some distinction in them. But
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, like the natural world is making no distinction between those things.
Right. Right.
It's
Right.
all
Right.
included. And so
Right.
I think that in some ways they're linked and they're
Yeah.
related.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah. I kind of just think of them as exactly the same thing.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously, there's just different delivery methods. So, you hinted at
Exactly.
you hinted at not even hinted. You just outlined some of the ways that I think about that. Like, one is
Hmm.
taking a commercial diet of some variety and sprinkling it onto existing greens, or favored greens, right? So this is something I do all the time, specifically with regard to, I'll use various, like, I'm sure I've posted videos of this where I've, for my chuckwallas, when they're you know getting a meal. Okay, it's actually, I feel the need to kind of explain why I do it this way. So bear with me for a second as I go just barely off topic. So chuckwallas, where they come from, out in Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Southern California, they're they very rarely, or at least very seasonally, I guess I should say, get wet greens. Right? It's very rare that they get wet greens. They're usually getting you know dry, desiccated leaves, plants, seed pods. Like, it's very little, right? They're not. It's not happening a lot. So I am very sparing with how much I feed actual, like, fresh, wet produce. I'm real sparing with it. But because I'm sparing with it, it means that when the animals get it, they're really psyched because they get, it's not often. They treat it as a very high value food, right?
Hmm.
And so what I do is I take advantage of that real strong food response by, every time I feed wet greens, I'm usually giving them something else on top of it, whether it's a calcium or vitamin supplement, or whether it's Repashy grub pie, which I do with the
Hmm.
chuckwallas with some regularity, because the chucks seem to be sort of, like the inverse of the polychrus, where it's like most of what they're eating is vegetation and plant matter, but they do seem to enjoy various feeder insects, and especially at various times.
Yeah.
So I'm treating the grub pie as, just something different, just something diverse. But I'll do that
Hmm.
with the Arcadia optimized 52 tortoise food. I will take that tortoise food and sprinkle it on the greens. I will mix that tortoise food with Missouri um, herbivorous reptile diet, and mix the two together, because they really love the Missouri stuff, and they're like
Hmm.
kind of on the fence. They're like a little iffy when they eat the Arcadia stuff. They eat it, but it's not like their
Hmm.
favorite food. But by combining the two, this offers again, it's a delivery method. This is more fiber, less protein. It's just a great way for them to get something like, at least the Arcadia optimized 52 is, right. It's mostly grass, different types of grasses. The same thing can be done, again, gut loading, uh, for an herbivore. I do this all the time. I just did this today. I'll do 1 or 2 fast days where the animals don't eat anything, and then I will walk around with grass clippings and throw small piles of grass clippings into the pen, right? Because again, what I'm doing is, by not feeding them for a day or two, it increases their appetite, makes them more likely to take something that they wouldn't normally take,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then dropping in a novel food source is both exciting, and it's going to be different nutrient wise. but it's kind of capitalizing on that hungry food response energy, because then they're actually going to eat it. Whereas if you had thrown grass in, but given them the regular diet, they're not going to eat it. They're going to ignore it. They're just not going to take it because they like the other stuff better. Right. So you're in a lot of ways, it feels like gut loading is like, and all these weird little things that we do are just different. They're just different strings on a guitar or a musical instrument. You know, you're playing them in different, at different times for different reasons, for different durations, or to invoke a certain, response that you're looking to get out of the animals. So anyway,
Yeah,
that's how I think about gut loading for herbivores.
very cool.
It's obviously not the same thing, right? It's like well, I mean, actually, no, I disagree. It's identical. It is exactly the same thing as giving extra food to your feeder insects. It's just the supplementation method, right? At least in my mind. So that's kind of how I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious to know if you have any reaction to that, if you disagree with me, or if you think that's weird or anything like that. What do you think?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, I mean, honestly, it's, again, without having firsthand like experimentation and experience with all that, I don't have a ton to like go off of in terms of like, trying to add more, color commentary on that perspective, or criticism either. I think that it makes a lot of sense. And I think that that's how I would orient,
Yeah.
as well.
Right.
I think I would approach it the same way, as you're doing here.
Do you think there's any quantitative difference between supplementation and gut loading? I mean, I feel, because the reason I ask it that way is not because of anything that any weird like vocabulary based beef that I have with gut loading, but just more that like I feel like by kind of expanding the conception of what gut loading could or may be, you're kind of, in other words, if it's just a form of supplementation and it's easy to do, it's not that hard to see gut loading a feeder insect as akin to kind of juicing up your salad for your herbivore with something a little bit that's like, it's because, again, in the same way that you're delivering an insect that has, or I mean, an insect is delivering all this stuff that you're trying to get to your animal that it wouldn't necessarily eat on its own otherwise. That's kind of, the premise, is that like, this is a delivery method. This is a way of getting those nutrients to your animals. And so in that same way, you're using the salad and when they haven't eaten for a couple of days, as a delivery method for this other thing that they might not eat as much of, but is really good for them. Right. So it's, to me, it's like it is exactly the same thing. Supplementation is gut loading is supplementation. And so it's like, being able to kind of expand your conception beyond I'm just feeding good food to my feeders, it kind of gives you like a different baseline for thinking about how to just give good shit to your animals, right? I mean, just like give them good stuff, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the only thing I would add is that I would say I don't think it's a supplement for like, or I don't, sorry, I don't think it's a substitute for the kind of supplementation, that we use in terms of supplementations like calcium, or or a multivitamin. I would say you want to do those as well in addition. So as long as like we're making that distinction that like when we're talking about like gut loading is supplementation, it's a form of supplementation, and there's this other form of supplementation that's also important for our herp care, which is powdered supplements.
Isn't it weird? Wouldn't you think like a more meaning laden term should be given to something like supplementation due to its necessity?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
like if it's something,
totally.
if it's something that you're having to do because you have to do it, supplement seems like the wrong word, because supplement is just to add, to give more, right? It's like to pile on top of some regard. You're superament any supplement, right? It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
So maybe we should start a trend where it's like, oh, or what supplements are you using? It's like, well, I have these supplements over here, but these are the completion mechanisms, or the or that's horrible. That's a terrible name, but something.
I'm following though. I'm getting what you're getting at.
Yeah, I'm not really a naming person. That's not really my scene, but
We
that's
actually
hilarious.
we have a couple questions that came up
Yeah,
specifically for you, Phil. I'm just gonna pose them your way real quick. Which is
yeah,
one
sure.
is Phil, are you saying that you can let the greens dry out and they're still okay for the beardies to eat? Question mark. And then the
Oh,
second
hell
one
yeah.
is, did you have any issues getting your animals to eat the optimized 52?
Okay, yeah. So I think the first question was definitely a joke, right? It was like it was sarcasm, right? It was like, oh,
No, I
you,
think it was
yeah,
serious.
really? Oh, okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's serious.
Well, if that's a serious question, then absolutely, yes, definitely feed. Yeah, if the greens dry out, you let that bearded dragon eat the hell out of those things. It's great. That's probably real good for them, right? There are
Mhm.
probably numerous times in the wild when they're getting dry greens for one reason or another, right? Whether it's that's the only thing that's available, or there's abundance of something. That's awesome. So yeah, great question. I thought it sounded like the same kind of thing as saying like, what, you can put your bearded dragon on sand, like I
Oh
thought it
yeah,
was kind
no,
of,
no, I get what you mean. Yeah, yeah,
but no,
yeah.
hopefully no
No,
offense to
I
the,
think it was totally earnest. Yeah.
okay, yeah, so my
I think that
apologies if I,
that's something I've definitely seen too, where people are like,
yeah,
as soon as the greens are dry at all, they'll remove them. And
yeah,
it's
that's
definitely,
great.
I think it's definitely a good idea to remove, uneaten greens
Yeah,
even once they've dried out after a couple of days or whatever, of course. But
yeah, prevent mold growth for
yeah,
sure, but and so
yeah,
I also should just say, my apologies, I didn't intend to belittle that question, so I'm hoping that the person who asked it didn't take offense. I didn't mean it that way.
I
um
don't think there was any offense taken. There was
okay,
just an
good,
LOL in the
good.
chat, so it's all good.
Okay, good. And then the second
Um,
one was the Arcadia Optimized 52. Did I have any trouble getting my animals to eat that?
yeah.
The answer is kind of yes and no.
Hmm.
Some of the animals, like for example, my chuckwallas took to that stuff right away. They loved it. They'll eat it bone dry, they'll eat it wet, they'll eat it on their greens. They really enjoy it. And I actually have to be careful about how much I put in there because the chuckwallas eat it, like they'll eat it dry all the time. So if I leave it in there, they'll just eat nothing. They'll eat tons of dry food, and I don't want them to eat that much dry food, right? So the chucks love it, but the Euros and the tortoises are kind of iffy. They'll eat a little bit of it. So what I have a tendency to do with the Euros is, like, people know that I have I have dishes in all the enclosures, and each dish I will fill up with different kinds of dry foods at various times of the year for various reasons. And so that can range everything from the Arcadia Optimized 52 to the herbal tortoise hay from tortoisesupply.com to Vionate, which is just a straight up supplement that I'll leave in the dish. Sometimes I'll put their greens in there. Sometimes I'll put calcium powder in there. Sometimes I'll put soaked Missouri tortoise pellets in there. Like, it's literally anything. Like, I'll just put anything they want to eat. That's where they get it. And so I'll leave the Arcadia Optimized 52 in those dishes from time to time, and the animals do eat it. But there's a limit to that. So if I want them to eat more, I leave them with no food for a couple of days, and then I put in the Arcadia Optimized 52. A lot of times I wet it when they haven't eaten in 2 days, just to give them a little bit of extra water. But they tend to, the Euromastics tend to prefer the Arcadia food dry. When it's wet, they will eat it. They'll take a few bites of it, but they don't eat a lot of it. Now, I would be interested to see what would happen if one was to try exclusively feeding Arcadia Optimized 52 and serve it only wet to a Euro. I bet you the Euro would be in great form, and it would probably it would develop a palate for that food and would probably eat it
Hmm.
like crazy in the state, because sometimes I've found that the animals of all kinds, not just the Euros, will develop. They have a taste. They have taste buds. They have a palate, right? So they have a sense of, like,
Yeah.
whether they like or dislike something, and you can kind of curb them towards wanting one thing or another. And usually, once they've eaten it a few times and they know it's good, they'll continue to consume it in one way, shape, or form. But yeah, so yes and no. My tortoises, which is what that food was formulated for, I have some Greeks and some Speckeye, and they don't touch it. They'll eat it like if I put it on the greens, but they won't eat it as it is. They won't, which is funny
Mm.
because I've seen video of people feeding their tortoises Arcadia Optimized 52 and the tortoises eating it. So I don't know what's wrong with
Right.
my 10 tortoises, or not 10. I don't have 10. How many do I have? 7, 8. My 8 tortoises, they don't like it,
A
but
bunch.
it's just 8 tortoises, so what do they know?
Yeah. One thing I'm also curious to hear you chime in a little bit about, Phil, just because I know we've talked about this a little bit in the past on the podcast. For those who don't know, Phil and I host a podcast called Project Herpetoculture.
This is the first I've heard about it.
But it's just kind of like maybe overdoing it, or is there a risk of overdoing it? And you talked about like, bee pollen being used really extensively with uromastics, or like really a heavy lentil diet for uromastics, and like the potential risk of actually, over conditioning your animal with these super rich sources of nutrition, and leading to obesity or gout or things like that, which are really common issues within captive herpetofauna. There's a lot of overweight animals out there, and who develop, health issues on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, definitely. I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this, but so let me start, I guess, by saying that, like, generally speaking, I think the baseline thing that happens most often in herpetoculture is that people overdo things. They just overdo it. They're always trying to go over. Well, when it comes to food, right? Because as I was mentioning earlier, because food is like an easy way to move the needle with your captive reptiles and amphibians, like it might be the easiest way, because you simply can't have them unless you feed them, right? Because they die. But you can conceivably go real low ball on your lighting or low ball on your enclosure and still go nuts feeding your animals. Now, I'm not suggesting anybody do that. I'm just saying that, like, one could do that, right? So when it comes to food, I generally tend to assume that my baseline is that I'm going to overdo it. So I'm always pulling back a little bit. I'm always kind of trying to, let me just pump the brakes. Let me exercise a little more caution, especially with the things that are supplements. So, when we know that, for example, the bulk of a diet for a uromastix is vegetation and plant matter, then I'm going to go pretty heavy on the vegetation and plant matter, but I'm not going to go that heavy on anything else, literally anything, whether it's an insect, whether it's bee pollen, whether it's lentils, whether it's commercial foods, whether it's anything like that. I'm always going to err. This is less than 5% of the diet, anywhere from 5 to 10% of the total overall diet. And it doesn't matter how much my animal loves his lentils. It doesn't matter how many times you want to see your animal come running over for the bee pollen. I don't, and it's going to vary, right? Like, I'm less worried about someone offering large amounts of red lentils, for example, to uromastics, because red lentils have like they're actually pretty good. Sometimes people will feed them soaked. They love the color of them. I mean, it's just a good thing to feed, but I still don't think it should exceed 10% of the diet. But then it's not the same as something like bee pollen, where a bee pollen granule, which is how they're so often fed, is like a granule of bee pollen represents a lot of flowers, right? Like, it takes like those little granules are really compact and actually contain a lot of bee pollen, right? And so you have to think, if you're feeding bee pollen, you give them like 10, 20 granules of bee pollen, that might be like 500 flowers. You know what I'm saying? Like depending on what kind of flower that bee pollen is made from, that could be an absolute nuclear nutrient bomb, such an insane amount of matter, like of dietary matter, is going to be directly delivered into your animal by way of bee pollen. Now, does that mean bee pollen is bad? No. I'm just saying it's the same thing with humans, where, like, one of the things that makes sugary beverages so bad for you is like the velocity, the speed at which all of that liquid sugar gets delivered into your bloodstream and into your system. Like, that's what's bad about it. It's not necessarily the exact, I mean, some of the contents are bad, but you know what I'm saying, right? And so I think about bee pollen in the same way that I think about sugary beverages. It's like, I'm going to give you like 3 to 5 granules of this once a week. You know, like I go on the really, really low end of everything I do that is a little different. You know, I don't like to think about feeding, if a feeder insect, for example, I don't, if I've got, you know, I might have, say, for example, a skink. Like I've got, actually, Savannah and I were talking about skinks, right? Like we both have Egernia hosmeri, and we were both talking about like how easy it is for some of those skinks to get really chunky, like real big, right? And how does one go about, you know, putting those animals on a diet, or helping them become a little leaner, right? And it's like the wrong answer probably is to like fast them in some, I mean, obviously short-term fasting is fine, but you don't want to just like starve your animal into leanness, right? Just like you don't want to do it for yourself. And so you know, you were talking about seasonality and context. I'm going to put a lot less gut loading effort into an animal that is in absolute prime condition with a full belly, and I'm going to put less gut loading into that than I would into, say, a xenogama that just laid a clutch of eggs. Like that thing that just laid a clutch of eggs, I'm going to try to get her like a big blast of nutrition and water, because that's going to be, it's going to be so utilized for her. And being able to get that so quickly after laying her eggs is just going to make her recovery that much easier and that much smoother. And conceivably lengthen her life, lengthen the length of time that she can breed. You know, I mean, all the good things happen from that. But, you know, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to give the same thing to my really gigantic Egernia hosmeri that doesn't seem to know the meaning of stop. You know, like when it comes to food, the thing just, it's just a hog, like a straight up hog, you know? So,
hogs mirai.
Yeah, hog mirai. So, you know, I guess the sort of the short way, the condensed way to talk about this is just to say that I just really go chill. I don't, I almost always err on the side of being a little more relaxed, a little more restrained. Let me just slow down. Let's always, like, ask Brendan, my guy here who helps me out at the shop. The whole theme of the last 6 months for me and him has been repeat after me. I will chill, you know? And it's not because he's not chill, but it's because that's kind of the mantra that I'm always looking to utilize. Like, you know, I unfortunately, if I kept going, I'd get into a story about some tortoises and why that became the mantra, but it's not an interesting story. So, and it's got nothing to do with gut loading. So,
well, I mean, I think that just I really appreciate you sharing all of that, just because I think that, as with anything, you know, it always depends. You know, this is becoming a mantra, I feel like, of just the show and just of kind of
yeah.
our orientation to herpetoculture in general, but it always depends. And I think it's always best to have your approach to herpetoculture, your approach to keeping, be observant, adaptive, and responsive, you know, to what the animal is telling you. And part of that is just, you know, familiarizing yourself with your animal's body condition, what a healthy, well-conditioned animal looks like for whatever that species that is, because it definitely varies from species to species, you know, and then adjusting, you know, your diet and supplementation regime accordingly. And, you know, again, I think that requires some flexibility, some trust from us, and there's, as with anything, there is an element of risk in it too. And I think that that's part of what, you know, is rewarding about herpetoculture, but can also be, for those of us who are a bit more anxious, can be hard, because we want to know the exact way to do everything. And the reality is that, you know, herpetoculture at its best is still a very imperfect science, art, you know, discipline. We're learning so much as we go, and you know, we're up against the reality that we're working with so many different species, and all of them have slightly distinct needs from one another. And it's not the same even as, all of the things that we've learned about, dog husbandry or cat husbandry or horse husbandry, which are still these very big, complex topics, but they're focused on, one species for each of those, disciplines. And yeah, I think it's just goes to show how much we still have to learn within herpetoculture on subjects like these, and how important it is to continue to be flexible and adaptive and observant with our animals.
Damn, dude, well said. Jesus Christ, Roy. You really just knocked that one out of the park. Couldn't have said it better. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons that I feel so passionately about what you just said is because I feel like it would be relatively easy to make your way into herpetoculture and kind of assume, based on the level of development that you see when you start participating in this world, that like, oh, we must have this figured out like the way we do dogs. I mean, we have commercial diets available, right?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, we must get this. Well, but unfortunately, that's I mean, in a lot of ways, all due respect to all the different brands that I utilize and rely on in various ways,
Yeah.
we're beta testing all of this. Like there's so little of any of this that is spelled out in an absolute way. I mean, really, we're really beta testing at the end of the day.
Yeah. So well said. It's true. There's a lot left to figure out. But I think also, again, just to reemphasize, and I know I just said this, but I think that's part of what makes it rewarding, and part of what makes it interesting. And I think that that's also something that we as a species, as Homo sapiens, as human beings, are uniquely well suited for, is pattern recognition and adaptive management, as I always call it. I think that that's a great thing to explore within herpetoculture.
Yeah, this really, that's right. Yeah, there are ways in which this is still very much like a Wild West in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like sure, the cowboy style Wild West of old herpetoculture that allowed you to get almost anything as a as a into your delivered to your door, like that might not be around anymore. But like, just because that's not here, I mean, there's still a hell of a lot to really unravel and understand. That's one of the reasons that I think people love this so much, is because there's still so much to be learned from all of this, because none of us has it all right. None of us has it like perfectly figured out or understood. Every one of us is still operating on a, well, maybe this is going to work. And, all of us still go to container stores and like, maybe there's going to be that one weird dish that's just going to be perfect, like,
Mm-hmm.
it's really cool. It's so awesome to have that. It's brilliant.
So true. Yeah. Makes it fun. Well, are there any other kind of like topics within this subject, Phil, that you want to touch on before we kind of get to any final questions and close it out for the day?
I didn't have anything.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that was a good kind of cursory, broad angle view at this subject and all that it entails. As you can see, um, it's a big one.
Say that again.
Oh, am I here still? Hang on. Okay. I guess we just had a weird little audio thing go on. But anyway, I want to give a shout out to Savannah for the production help and also for the insight that she offered in the chat. Also to Ayana for a lot of good insight in the chat, and to everyone else who's contributed in the chat and put in good questions and good insight. Just really appreciate all of you. And I can just I really admire the love for the animals that is evident in everyone's engagement. I can really see that that's at the heart of it. And that's just always refreshing to see. So If there are any final questions, please throw them in the chat now and we can get to it before we close out. There's no pressure, of course, but we're happy to dive in to anything else that might be remaining. Let's see anything. And also, of course, got to give a shout out to Phil. Thank you, man, for being my co-pilot here, even though you're just a little squiggly guy right now on the screen. I still love you. I still appreciate you.
Right back at you, man. Sorry, I didn't get to show my face. I don't know what's
I know,
going
really,
on.
the people really missed out today on that. I mean, come on, man. Yes, please, Ayana, in the chat, please throw all the links you want into the chat. I'd be happy to have them to studies. And what we can do also is we can post those in the video description for folks to find as well, because Ayana is super dedicated to this subject and has mined Google Scholar very well for relevant information. So hopefully we can pass that along.
Very nice.
Cool. Well, I think that's it. Thanks again, everybody. I think we're going to close it out, and I wish you all a good weekend, and we'll be back with some more live content soon. Hopefully, hopefully before too long. Take care until then.
Thanks, y'all.
Wow.